Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. It's a line from Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. And in this short video, I'd like to give you a simple explanation of what Kierkegaard meant and his basic advice, a life lesson, as it were, for quote unquote turning your life around, what he called taking a leap of faith. But I would also like to talk a little bit more about this Kierkegaardian concept of anxiety from a Freudian and Lacanian perspective. And I'd like to break this down in the following 10 minutes. So first of all, when Kierkegaard argues that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, what he means, to put it very simply, although this lacks some of the complexity of his argument, that it can be really paralyzing when you have freedom. Like, think about it. You're sitting in your room thinking about all the things that you could do, and yet somehow you get nothing done. Like, you spend so much time planning your life, but it can be really difficult to actually begin doing something. And this is because as soon as you start going in one direction, it means that there are other doors that close. In fact, as you get older, you will experience this. Like, the more things you've done, including the things that you've done successfully, the more it means that there are certain things that you can't do. Like, by definition, I will never be a professional classical pianist at this point in my life. Not that I ever could have been, but by now it's definitely too late. And so the more you commit yourself to one path, the more it can feel like you're giving up on other things. And it can feel like a safe option to just sit at home doing nothing, contemplating what you might do someday. And yet this is paralyzing. This is what Kierkegaard calls the anxiety that comes with freedom. Freedom as a kind of abyss, the power to do anything that yet renders you impotent. However, there's also a secondary argument here. Kierkegaard is saying that one way in which we release ourselves from this anxiety is to impose prohibitions and restrictions upon ourselves arbitrarily. For example, you could say, well, I can't do this. There's no way I can do this, so I might as well not try. Or you come up with a person, a master, a figure who essentially prohibits you from doing the thing you want to do. For example, let's say that you're working a job that you don't like. Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to go home and rethink my life and actually take the risk to find another job, you say to yourself, no, I can't do this because of X. You come up with like a rationalization that allows you to persist in doing the thing you don't want to do so that you can persist in your anxiety. And yet the secret satisfaction that comes with this prohibition is that it nevertheless upholds your dream. Like, yeah, I could have done X, but I never got around to it. It's like you can always retain the imaginary idea that you could have done something remarkable because you never started. In fact, this is a truism, including for some self-help videos, that secretly we fear committing ourselves to our dream. Because what if it turns out that we can't do it? Like, what if it turns out that the thing we wanted most, we actually couldn't have? And so it's very tempting to say to yourself, well, I'm not going to do it. Like, I could have done it, but somebody kept me from doing it. And so this prohibition actually allows us to essentially take a pass on our own life. It allows us to remain in a kind of self-imposed mediocrity. Against this, Kierkegaard argues that at a certain point you have to take a leap of faith. The aphorism that he employs is that he says that life is not a problem to be solved, but something to be experienced. And this is very Hegelian. Hegel argued that you can't learn how to swim by observing people swimming. At a certain point, you have to jump in the water. You have to figure it out yourself. Now, granted, you want to have someone who teaches you how to swim, lest you drown, but it's not something that can be solved like a problem from a distance. You simply have to do it yourself. And so Kierkegaard argues that you have to take this leap of faith. At a certain point, you simply have to place a bet on yourself. You have to go all in, and this is when you figure it out. Now, on a totally basic personal level, what I would say is that often this is the only way to actually do anything. Like, it's a fantasy to think that you could stay at home and plan in advance exactly how your dream plan is going to work. Instead, what you have to do is you have to simply every single day work at it, and you figure it out as you go along. And this takes time and perseverance, and it will change you in the process of so doing. And that is exactly what Kierkegaard means. You essentially accept that you have to take this leap of faith, that you have to embrace as it were, the full responsibility of your actions, thereby no longer making excuse for your passivity. You can't blame anybody else except yourself if it goes wrong. And there's also Kantian overtones here. Kant's idea of a mature mind and a mature life is someone who no longer requires a master, someone who essentially becomes their own master, as it were. Now, I'd like to conclude by briefly talking about the Freudian Lacanian elaborations of this theory of anxiety, which, first of all, I should say that the way in which Kierkegaard conceives of anxiety has nothing to do with the contemporary clinical idea of anxiety as such. Lacan has an interesting theory about anxiety, where he says that anxiety isn't about what we can't have or can't do. Instead, anxiety occurs when there's an over proximity to the thing we want. And let me give you an example. Let's say that what you really want is like an expensive car, and you think, oh, my life's gonna be perfect if one day I can buy this car. And then you buy it, like you've achieved your goal, and yet as you're sitting in the car, it suddenly feels symbolically void. Like it's lost its appeal because you have it. In fact, the truth is that often we want things because we think that we can't have them. And so we're back at the Kierkegaardian idea of the dialectic of prohibition. You want it because you feel like you can't have it. This means that the trap is that once you have it, you need to come up with something else that you want, so you're simply chasing your own tail. And Lacan says that anxiety is therefore the truth of all enjoyment, that secretly what we desire is desire itself, and that what we fear is to someday be fully satisfied, because once we stop desiring, we lose our sense of self. And so Kierkegaard's argument about the leap of faith isn't necessarily about how exactly you're supposed to achieve your goals, which would be a self-help idea. That's not what he's interested in. Instead, it's a philosophical problem about how you can master this process of desire so as to instruct your own ethical and moral framework. In fact, Kierkegaard says that from a theological perspective, the problem of freedom emerges when Adam becomes aware as to the possibility of his own freedom when it comes to eating the apple of good or evil, which is to say, now he has to make a rational choice. Does he want to eat it or does he not? And yet the deceptive part of this story is that in a sense, God isn't simply testing Adam, he has already corrupted Adam because the very prohibition will lead Adam into his desire. Hence, when Adam commits the sin, which will have him be expelled from the Garden of Eden, he is also accessing subjectivity proper. Subjectivity proper being the opportunity to become fully responsible for the ethical outcomes of your own decision-making. And this, from a Kantian, but also Lacanian and Kierkegaardian perspective, is what true freedom means. It's the opportunity to fully assume this anxiety, this abyss of freedom, to curtail yourself, as G.K. Chesterton once wrote, every act of will is an act of self-limitation, to impose upon yourself an ethical and moral framework, which is thereby a system of limitations that allows you to pursue one thing. And this pursual of one thing above everything else is the ultimate act of freedom. It is focusing on one thing that you want to do and committing to it completely, which, of course, is another way of characterizing love, making yourself subject to someone or something that thereby retroactively gives you a sense of life. And in this process of making yourself subject to something that goes beyond everything else, you feel fully alive. You experience life fully, not as a problem to be solved, as Kierkegaard says, but as something to be experienced. The way to escape the anxiety of freedom is to take the leap of faith.